Hi, I'm Mike Yeager, and I'm going to be talking about using the Microsoft.Extensions.AI, what that is and why you'd want to use it. It's pretty cool stuff. So this is a Code Presents. These are just free things we do for the community. Let me tell you a little bit about myself first. Again, I'm Mike Yeager. I'm the CEO of Code Consulting. So we do custom software as well as traditional consulting. I came up as a developer and a manager, so I've got a tech background. Worked a lot on AI projects. I still do some speaking. And if you want to get a hold of me, send me an email, ask me a question. myeager@codemag.com is a really good place to do that. So let me tell you a little bit about my organization. Again, I'm with Code Consulting, so we do most of the development stuff. We have Code Staffing, which is a really cool staffing setup. And it's different than most staffing. You know, people hate staffing. The staffers don't like it. They're not happy. The customers don't like it because they don't get quality people and the people aren't happy. So we've done something a little bit different. And staffing for us is you come work for Code Staffing. So you're an employee, you get vacation, you get benefits, you get all that good stuff. You get treated really well. You're part of a community. You have people that you can talk to and work with. And then you're placed with a client. So that client gets somebody who's well taken care of and happy and trained and all that good stuff. So it's been working out really well. If you're interested in that from either side, let us know and we can help you with that. We also do Code Magazine, which is a development trade magazine. So it's mostly technical magazine for developers. And at the end of this talk, I'll give you a link. If you don't have a subscription already, you can get a free digital subscription for a year. We also do print magazines. So if you like print, you can get that as well. And then there's code training, customized training for companies. You know, say you've got a company that needs to implement Copilot for 100 people and they just don't know, you know, you can't just drop it on their desk and assume that they're going to become productive. So we do that kind of training and also this, things like Code Presents, free training for the community. So uh, take advantage of our training stuff. So today we're going to talk about these extensions.ai. Why do I even care? What's its support? When would I choose it over something else? How do I use it? I'll do a lot of demos. I'm just going to go through some slides here fairly quickly so that we can get to the demos because I know that's always the good part. But I just want to give you, kind of set you up for success and give you some background and some grounding where we're coming from, what we're talking about, so that I just don't start flying through some code that, you know, don't really know why I'm doing it. So what this is it's a set of libraries and it's an abstraction layer over AI stuff. So if you want to do chat or text completion in the day, you would have to go and write to an API. And sometimes there was an SDK that you could use. But each company had their own thing set up, and the way that you process this stuff was different. Everyone did things a little bit different, and that story is getting better. But there's still quite a lot of that out there. And moving from, you know, oh, I want to do something locally on my machine to I want to call something from OpenAI in the cloud to I want to use, you know, an Anthropic model was a lot of rewriting of code. So this is a library that sort of abstracts all that stuff and it adds a bunch of utilities. So things like caching and telemetry and logging. And we'll show you examples of all of the stuff. We won't be able to get into all the utilities, but at least doing chat and embeddings and image generation and how it makes your life easier there. So it's a set of NuGet packages, and the first two listed there on the left are the most important. So there's Azure Extensions.AI and Extensions AI.abstractions, and the abstractions are really the key. So in a very lightweight situation, you might just use the abstractions themselves, and that gives you something like an iChat client, so that you have a generic client that no matter what backend it's hooked up to, which LLM it's hooked up to, which model, everything works the same. The extensions.AI includes the abstractions. Most of the other libraries include the abstractions, and they give you some additional things that you'll probably need. So that's usually a good way to start, is with the extensions.ai. And then if you want to hook into OpenAI, if you want to hook into Azure Foundry, if you want to hook into Ollama, you'll notice the Ollama one here is deprecated. They sort of moved that to Ollama. So they make their own now. So instead of being called Microsoft.Extensions.AI Ollama, it's called Ollama Sharp. But it's basically they took over that package. And then there's packages and utilities, things like evaluation. How good are my prompts doing? Are they degrading? Can I look at this model versus that model and evaluate how well they're doing? So there's packages for that as well, but the ones we're interested in most today are extensions.ai and the Azure Inference and OpenAI and the Ollama Sharp, because we're going to connect to those backends to different models and take a look at that. Why do you care? If you are coding to a specific API, you kind of get locked in, even though a lot of people are converging now. Things like the OpenAI API is fairly common. A lot of people are starting to use that. But still, when you move from one system to another, you kind of get stuck. You have to rewrite a lot of code. If you say, oh, there's this new model from this new company and I want to adjust and use that, you're probably going to have to do a lot of new code. So I would say for the most part, you don't want to start at a very low level. You want to start with something that's a little bit higher, or something that's even higher than that. We'll talk about those 3 levels here in a minute. Also, it's tedious to write all the low-level code. Creating an HTTP client and then putting your call together and passing it and then getting stuff back and then figuring out how do I stream this and getting the streaming response from the chat and then streaming it to your UI. There's a lot of stuff in there. And it's really not fun to write. So this gives you a generic way of doing it, and they handle a lot of that stuff for you. And again, we'll take a look at that in some of the demos. So what does it support? Which providers can I use? Which models can I use? You can use just about anything. It supports, as I said, OpenAI, so you can go right to them. It supports Azure OpenAI, which they've converged their API to be very, very close to what OpenAPI's is. And that's been a traditional way for a lot of corporate customers, especially to work with AI. The new kid on the block is the Azure Foundry, which brings a whole lot of different functions together. So it's not just big models like GPT, it's also any model you can think of, DeepSeek or whatever, and you can fine tune the models right there on Foundry. So if you don't want to run models locally, even if they're small enough to run locally, and you don't want to do your fine tuning, and Foundry is a great place, and then you can just hook up to it with these extensions. So it makes it pretty nice. Ollama is great for running things locally on your machine. There's Ollama for Mac and Linux and Windows, and a lot of the Ollama stuff actually runs on CPU. Some of it will run on GPU and NPU. Turns out CPU is pretty good for most things anyway. I haven't found a whole lot of difference for smaller models between CPU and something else. Now, it's nice if you can put it on the NPU and then have your CPU doing something else, but it's not necessarily faster. And that's a great, easy way. You just download it and install it, and then you can use their UI and say, I want to use this model, and if it doesn't have it locally, it'll download it. And then you can, try some stuff out, and then it exposes an endpoint, just a URL that you can hook into. So that's how you can use it on your local machine or share it in a more or less generic way. And they go pretty much with the OpenAI model yourself. Then you can create your own provider. So if none of these work for you, you can create anything you want. Anything using the OpenAI protocol is pretty easy. It's not difficult at all. If you want to do something that's way out there where the implementation is kind of funky, then you may have to write a little bit more code because you're translating their calls into this standard way of doing things. But it ain't rocket science. So you can create one. People are creating them for PhiSilica, which is the model. It's a small language model that's part of the Windows operating system now. So only if you have a Windows Copilot PC, whether it's Intel or Snapdragon, if you have a Copilot PC, PhiSilica will download onto your machine. If you've got a new version of Windows, they'll update it for you as part of Windows Update, and it's used for different things. The Paint app uses it for stuff, and you can also use it as a developer. So people are writing providers for this, or you can create your own, put it together, and use that. Onyx models. So Onyx is a way of making a model a little more generic and also making it perform better. So you quantize the model, you essentially shrink it so that it's more or less compressed, so that it performs better and takes up less space, and then it can be optimized for things like GPU or CPU or NPU or whatever hardware you have for it. So it's sort of an abstraction layer on the LLM itself. So you can use, if there's not a provider out there, there may be one soon, or you can create your own without a whole lot of work, so that you can use models from pretty much everywhere for all sorts of tasks in a generic way. And it's really nice. I do like the way that they've done this, especially having had to write that low-level code in the past. I really enjoy it. So let's talk about where this fits in. I talked a little bit already about the low level. So you have usually HTTP calls where there's an SDK, and you have this very specific interface with all kinds of knobs and dials. If you're going to lock in and say, I'm going to use this model, I'm going to use this provider, and I want all the latest features available to me. Maybe there's something that comes out tomorrow that's really cool, and you want to use it, and maybe the AI extensions don't support it yet, but it is supported through the low-level APIs. There's nothing to say that you can't do that one call with a low-level API and then use extensions for the rest of it. At this point, who's got time to do low-level coding on specific ADIs and SDKs that lock you into something if you don't have to? So there may be an instance where that's a good idea, but I try and shy away from that as much as I can these days. And then on the other side, there's really high-level stuff, things like semantic kernel. So if you want to build like an agentic framework, you want to do orchestration, you have all these prompt templates, and you want to include all that and build something that's higher level. It's not really just the interaction with the AI stuff, but it is building your agents and your systems and your prompt template library and all that good stuff. Then semantic kernel may be a great way for you to go. This is kind of in the middle. The extensions are, again, mostly abstraction, and they add some really nice utilities. They're adding stuff to it. It's becoming more powerful. Semantic kernel, in fact, uses the Microsoft extensions. They used to have to write stuff themselves and handle a lot of things that they went, you know what, we can just use this and it'll save us a bunch of time, and we don't have to do all that code anymore. So if you're building a framework, or you're building something that doesn't require, say, an agentic framework or plan orchestration, then maybe extensions is the right place to be. I would say it's sort of a default choice these days if you're going to build something. A lot of projects, really, it's a perfect target for that mid-level of, it's not this whole framework I have to buy into, and it's not I have to do everything myself. So how do you use it? They give you things like iChat client. So if you want to do a chat, you fire up an iChat client and you use that iChat client the same no matter where the model is or which model it is. iImage generator, if you want to generate images. iEmbedding generator. So if you want to do semantic lookups, there's this whole idea of semantics where you say, well, I'm not looking for the keyword car. I'm looking for anything that's like a car, an automobile, a bus, a vehicle, whatever. So the idea there is that you translate text into a bunch of numbers, and then you can mathematically find things that are similar. So if I do a search and I say, what's the average speed of a car on this road, then it can look at all the text that's been translated into numbers and find things that are talking about something very similar. And it says, oh, these are similar to what you were looking for. And it doesn't use the word car or auto or any actual words. It just, the meaning is in the numbers. And it's actually very powerful. And it's the basis of most RAG systems, where you're doing retrieval augmented generation. You go look something up, you take the information that comes back that's really the answer to the question they want to ask, and then you push that into the model and say, here's the answer, here's what I'm looking for, here's the question they asked, make this all sound nice. And it writes nice English based on giving it the answer, and that helps cut down a lot on hallucinations. There's also things like open telemetry and logging and dependency injection. All that stuff is built into these libraries so that you don't have to roll your own. So let's do the demo. Let's get to the fun part. This is just the most basic thing I could think of. It's a console app in .NET 8. And I've gone ahead and added the packages. So you'll see the Azure AI, OpenAI, which is the old way of doing things without the extensions. And it allows us to talk to OpenAI or Azure OpenAI. And then we have the extensions and the Azure AI inference, which is Azure Foundry stuff. And then there's the OpenAI stuff. And then down here we have the Ollama, which again is the Microsoft.Extensions.AI Ollama, but it's been taken over by them, so the name changed. And that's sort of the setup for this. You can see I've got some strings and I'm reading my keys out of a config file, so they're not shown here. But I did show some examples. So the old Azure OpenAI that we've been using for a while, that's one of their endpoints. If you want to look at, in this case, I'm using a DeepSeek model from Azure Foundry. So that's a different kind of an endpoint. And then Ollama, just by default, hosts everything on localhost on this port. And then I'm just telling it which models I might want to use. And then I've got this standard question that I'll use in my examples. So let's go ahead and take a look at the first example here. It's Azure OpenAI Chat. So this is a little bit older code. This doesn't use the new stuff. And I just want to do this as by way of an example. So this is not going to be an iChat client. This is going to be a chat client, which is part of the OpenAI, Azure OpenAI library. So that's why we have this Azure AI OpenAI here. And this is kind of the old way of doing it. You say, I want a new OpenAI client, and you give it the endpoint and the credentials, your secret key, and it creates a client that's specific to that particular provider of LLMs. Then you take the client and you ask it a question. So in here, I'm going to say, complete chat streaming async, and I'm just going to pass in that standard question, which is, take this phrase and turn it into Pig Latin. And then you have to await, because you're streaming this, you're going to do an await for each, which is handled in the Azure OpenAI library, but a lot of libraries it's not. So you have to write a lot of code to deal with streaming. This one's actually pretty nice, but it is still a little clunky. So you get various updates from this streaming AI, and then within each update, you can have various chunks of content. So there's a collection with collections in it, and you glue all this together, and it comes up and writes something out. So let's give this a whirl. I'm going to go ahead and run it, and this is going to be GPT-4, so that's our model that we're hitting. And again, I'm hitting it in Azure OpenAI. And this is going to be a little slow. I'm sorry, this is a little bit older computer. And I am recording this, and I got slides running and a whole bunch of stuff, and that just makes it very slow. So GPT-4 comes up with this. That's my answer. And that's how you say that phrase in Pig Latin. Like, okay, that's great. Let's look at a slightly different version of that same thing. So I'm going to build on what I have. I'm still going to use this Azure OpenAI client. So it's exactly the same as above, the same endpoint, the same API key, the same chat deployment. This part is completely identical to the previous sample. But on the end, I'm going to use this extension method as AI chat client. As iChat client. And that turns it into a generic client. And then I can use that client in a bunch of ways. So as we connect to different backends, if I end up with an iChat client, my code from this point forward doesn't have to change at all. I can do it the same way. And you'll find the first thing that's pretty nice here is that I don't have to do for each inside of a for each. And I get the await for each functionality, which is great. So it's a little bit different call from this client. It's called get streaming response async. And I pass in the question, and it gives me back the chunks. So as the chunks come streaming in, they just get written into here, and I can write them out to the screen. So let me go ahead and run this one instead of the last one. So same model, actually the same everything, except we've got this abstraction layer that it's going to make it a little bit easier to work with. And if I move to other stuff, like we'll see in a minute, it's not going to make everything change from underneath me. So works very much the same. And you get between runs, but that's basically how you say that in Pig Latin. Okay, so now we're working with an iChat client. Makes it very nice. Now, what if I want to do something like, oh, that's great, but GPT-4 is expensive and I want to use DeepSeek. You know, DeepSeek made a lot of waves not too long ago about how good it was and inexpensive it was, and every thinking examples. So we'll see here that in this case, I'm not using the Azure OpenAI client like I am above. I'm connecting to Azure AI Foundry. So I don't want to run this DeepSeek locally. I'm going to have AI Foundry run that for me. So it's a different endpoint, and it's a different client, but you know, I've got a credential. And in this case, my model's not GPT-4, it's my DeepSeek model. So if we go look up here, it's, in this case, DeepSeek R1 is the model I'm using instead of the GPT-4 model. This part, identical. There is really no difference here. Get streaming response async and write it out to the console. So once I do this as iChat client, all my code, no matter what I'm connecting to, which model it is, which provider it is, which client I'm using, as long as there's an abstraction for it, from this point on, everything's going to work the way I'm used to. So this is the DeepSeek client extension. So very similar to the last one, but we're going to use DeepSeek. And this one's going to be chatty because, like I said, this is a deep thinking model. So it's going to tell you everything about how it's doing it. It's doing reasoning. It's saying, okay, let's break this down into steps. This is how you do Pig Latin. This is the phrase. Here's the first thing. Now you can shortcut some of this and just tell it that I don't want to see all that. But you can see this is the default output. And this model is designed to do thinking things, not just give quick answers. So I could say in my prompt, just give me the answer and not all this stuff. But here's its chain of thought as it was coming up with this. And it gives you an explanation, and it gives you the answer here. And it's always a little bit different. What we're interested in is that it's not very different for us in our coding. So I just hooked up to something different, but I ended up with the same iChat client. Now, what if I wanted to run a local model, say one of the Ollama models or a DeepSeek model or whatever? I need a way to run that on my local machine. Ollama is a great way to do that. So I'm going to use the Ollama Sharp to get my client. So you can see here, I just say it's an Ollama API client, and I get back, just like before, an iChat client. And I can await just like before. All of this code is the same from here down. I did make a note here. Ollama uses the standard OpenAI protocols. So you can talk to it just like you talk to OpenAI. And they support all of that. I'm not really sure why you would, but you can. I could have done this with an OpenAI client, and the code is here, and said, "Give me a chat client back," and that would work as well. Now, Ollama probably is not spun up on my machine, so this is going to be a little bit slow. And if it needs to load this thing into memory, you'll notice that it is actually quite slow. Again, it's not nearly this slow when I'm not recording. And if it's cached and loaded up, then it actually happens pretty quickly. This is going to seem like an eternity, but once it's loaded, it can be pretty fast. And if you load this, if you have it running on a machine and people are connecting to it through that URL it exposes, then you can be in pretty good shape because it's going to respond a lot faster. So I don't want you to think this is going to be typical response times for running something through Ollama. But this is a 6-year-old machine with video going on and all kinds of stuff, and it was not warmed up and loaded. Now, if I run that same thing again, you'll notice that it's going to be a little bit faster. And you can see the responses streaming in, so you can see how that await async is working. And that's a little more typical time frame for something like that. All right, let's talk about images. So I said there's an iChat client, there's an iMage generation client. Let's look at how that works. So very similar code to before. I'm going to get an iMage generator. So this, no matter what I'm connecting to on the back end, in this case, my Azure OpenAI account happens to have DALL-E 3. So I'm going to fire up a DALL-E 3 model on that client. I'm using my same Azure endpoint as before, saying this is the model I want to use, and give me back a generic iMage generator. And once you have that, you can just say generate image. So if you compare this to doing a chat, it's fairly similar. So this is a chat completion client, and then you're getting a streaming response, and this is a image client, and you're going to say generate images async. So I just tell it what I want an image of, how many images I want. In this case, I just want one. The size of the image that I want back. So no matter which backend I'm connecting to, I can generate images fairly easily. And then I just run through these images. I'm essentially grabbing with an HTTP client, grabbing the image that it generated. So it's going to give me a response back and say, here's a URL where you can get the bytes. I'm going to write all the bytes to a local file, and then I'm just going to use shell execute and fire it up, and whatever app processes images on my machine will show me images. That's what I'm going to see here. So let me comment this and go down to the DALL-E sample. So we're going to be running this code now. And again, the interesting code is really this getting the client, and then this guy right here. And then it's a matter of just, grabbing the bytes and displaying them. So I want a cute baby sea otter wearing a beret. So I will fire that up. And again, not the fastest machine, but it's going to go out and actually generate the image on the internet, which is quite fast. And then it's going to give me back that URL. I'm going to download all those bytes, and then I'm going to stick it into a file. So it's going to tell me the file that it's putting it into, because I wrote some code to do that. And now it's just going to shell execute and fire up an app. And there is, I guess that's cute, with a beret. And if I run it again, it's probably going to be a little bit faster the second time. And it'll create a second image for me. Or I could tell it I want, 3 images, and I could get, and process all 3. And it'll do 3 variations so that I can pick one that I like. So pretty cool example there. And again, a very generic way of accessing this AI stuff, this AI functionality. All right, moving on. I talked about generating embeddings. So that whole thing about semantic search, where you take some text like this and you turn it into a bunch of numbers, and then you stick it in a database, whether it's a semantic database or a SQL database or whatever. Most databases now support these numbers, these embeddings, and have an algorithm that you can search for these embeddings so that you can find things that are similar. So generating the embeddings in the first place is kind of a big task, especially if you have a ton of text. You break the text up, maybe you break it up into paragraphs or pages, and then you run it through this thing and it gives you back a bunch of floating point numbers. And then when somebody asks a question, you go through that same process, turn that into numbers, and then you say, give me the top 3 things that are closest to this, so that are talking about the same thing, for example. So how do you do that? Again, it's just getting a standard interface back that you can deal with. So in this case, it's an I embedding generator. So they're putting this abstraction on top of it. In this case, I'm going back to my Azure OpenAI again, because I just happen to have a lot of these things already set up and running up there. And I'm giving it my endpoint, my key, and I'm saying, well, here's a text embedding model. And there's a few out there that you can use. In this case, I'm getting the text embedding 3 small model. And as you get the medium and the bigger models, they tend to do a little bit better, but this is going to be cheaper and faster, and it's also something I could potentially run locally. And then what it gives me back is this embedding client, which in this case is the original text. There's a string, and then there's an embedding of float. So it's just this class around the number, the float number that comes back. This would be a good place to use var instead, because it can determine that that's what it's going to use. It would look a little less clunky than it does. So I go ahead and I get the client, and then I say embedding client generate vector async, and I send in my text, and it gives me back the embeddings. And then very similar to before, in this case, I'm not getting chunks of text back, or I'm not getting an image back. I'm actually getting back these arrays of numbers. So I'm just going to loop through the embeddings that come back, and I'm going to write them out to the screen. Let me make sure I'm running the right sample here. And we'll get that running. All right, generating embeddings for this. And here we can see this is what embeddings look like. They're just a whole bunch of numbers. And it's always the same length. So when you generate embeddings, there's always the same number, no matter how much text there is. So in this case, I'm doing a fairly standard size of 1535 or 1536, I guess, because there's a 0 in there. And that's just showing you what it's like. Now you put this into a database and then you can search on it using one of those algorithms, and you've got retrieval augmented generation. So that's a really nice way. If you've ever coded this stuff by hand, you'll just see how wonderful that actually is. Here's another example. Calling tools is something that you do fairly often. So a tool is some code that you write. And in my case, for my example here, I just grabbed this from a sample somewhere on the internet, but it just gets a random number and says, well, it's either sunny or it's raining. So my entire weather service is just this little bit of C# code that's all put down to one line, but it can be anything you want. And so what happens is you describe the tool, what it does, what its capabilities are. So usually you put some kind of a description on it. In this case, just the actual name of it is good enough, get current weather. So I really don't need to tell it a big description, but you load these tools up, and then when you call the LLM, you say, hey, these tools are available and this is what they do. And the LLM could look at the tools, decide if it wants to use one, and if it does, it'll orchestrate calling the tool for you. And if you've ever done this by hand, this was a pain in the neck, because you had to set up like a callback URL, and when you're done, call me here with the answer, and then if you want to call another tool. So there was a lot of plumbing involved. This makes it quite a bit easier. So in this case, I'm calling an Ollama model again. So hopefully it'll be a little bit quicker now, since my Ollama model is already loaded. And I'm getting a chat client, but I'm saying on this client, don't just use it as is. I want to make a builder out of it. I want to do function invocation. In this case, I'm using OpenTelemetry, so I can put telemetry on my stuff, have logging in here. So here's how you can use some of those other tools and utilities and just take advantage of what's available to you. So if you want to use all those evaluation libraries, relatively easy to do. Once you've got something into an iChat client or an iImage generator or one of these abstracted concepts, you can put logging and telemetry and caching and all kinds of features on it relatively easily. So here's just an example of using a builder to go add some additional functionality to it. And then in this case, I'm going to create some chat options, and I'm going to say some new chat options, and I want to use the AI function factory, and I want to add this tool. So I'm going to make this tool available to the LLM. And in this case, it's an Ollama model. And I'm going to tell that model, hey, here's a tool you can use if you want. Here's how you call it. And then I'm going to say, should I wear a raincoat? So that's going to be my question. And the model is probably going to want to use this get current weather and give me an answer based on that. But you'll notice that this is the same get streaming response async as we did before. Instead of just passing in a question, I'm passing in some options as well. And in this case, it's a different question than what we answered before, because Pig Latin and tools, I'm not sure how that goes together. But we're going to go ahead and just cycle through it just like we did in the previous example. So let me make sure I'm running the correct one. I am. And again, this is going to call an Ollama model, and I'm going to make this tool available to it so that it can make a call out and find out what the weather is, so that when it gives me an answer, it's well informed. And I guess that model fell out of cache. So again, in production, this is it's going to be quite a bit faster than this, but it is reloading that model. Okay, in that case, I did not get a good call. Well, that's interesting. That does happen occasionally. So when you're calling the tool, there's some parameters passed. This is how it figures out what parameters need to be passed. So let me just go ahead and call that again and see if we can get it to work this time. It works about 99% of the time. So tool calling with extensions and my Ollama model running on my old laptop here is going to figure that it needs to call that tool, and once again it's not going to work. So we'll try it just one more time, and if it doesn't work, we'll just chalk that up to the bad demo gods and move on, but it definitely should go ahead and work with this particular tool. There you go. You should definitely wear a raincoat to keep you dry in the current weather conditions. All right, so what it did behind the scenes, and I didn't have logging turned on, so we couldn't see its thought process and the fact that it was calling things, but it called this get current weather method, and it's just randomly picked between raining and sunny, and gave me an answer back. So that is Extensions.AI, and I hope you can see how valuable that kind of stuff can be. Again, we didn't have time to get into the logging and the caching and other stuff that would have made the demo maybe a little bit nicer and faster. But it should give you a pretty good idea. I told you earlier that there's a free subscription to the magazine. So if you would like that, you can scan this code or go to the bit.ly CP1025 subscribe here, and we'll give you a free year digital. Also, we really appreciate it if you take the survey. So it's CP1025 survey, or you can scan the code and it'll take you there as well. And your feedback really helps us improve these sessions. So if you could take a minute and do that, I would really appreciate you doing it. Thank you very much. And we'll just end up with a few slides in here, and you will get all this in the deck. You'll get my code samples. All of it will be available. So you can look through all that, and anything that we didn't cover to your satisfaction, if it's not in there, just drop me an email. I got my email again at the end. If you're looking at AI and you need to get people on board and you want questions answered and get over that hump of, we don't seem to be doing anything in AI, an executive briefing is a good way to do that. If we do it online, usually it's a free thing. We'll actually just, spend an hour or two with your management and answer all their questions and give them a briefing on what they can do with it. If you want us to come out and do one in person, obviously that's not going to be free, but pretty reasonable. I talked about staffing, and staffing needs you. And we have a YouTube channel, so this video and a bunch of others are going to be on youtube.com/codemag. So definitely encourage you to check that out. You can follow us on LinkedIn. And again, there's my email, myeager@codemag.com. And I will be, even though this is pre-recorded, I'll be online and answer your questions. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will talk to you all very soon, and I hope to hear from you.